All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to today's WNBA Author Talk. My name is Julie Frey and I'm a member of the Women's National Book Association's Greater Philadelphia chapter. And I also serve as the WNBA's Communications and Events Chair. Today we are excited to welcome Christina Baker Kline, a #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. She is published in 40 different countries, and her novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes. And her books have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as one book, one read selections. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christina.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm delighted to be here. Your organization is great, and this is really fun. Thank you.
A quick note, if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to write any questions you have in the Q&A. We will be checking them. I will be checking them throughout the talk, and there'll be time at the end to ask the questions. So to begin, Christina, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Let's see. I grew up in Maine. I was born in England. My parents are Southern, but I grew up in Maine, which we can discuss later if you want to. Since last March, I've been living in Southwest Harbor, Maine, which is right on the coast, on Mount Desert Island, which is an island off the coast of Maine. We have an apartment in New York City that we have a kid living in right now, and it's just been a crazy time, but I'm really happy to be with you here tonight.
Well, we're so happy to have you.
And Julie, you're in Philadelphia, just outside of Philly.
Yes, I am. And I'm very thankful that the weather held out today.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you are.
It's very like rainy and wet, but not freezing, even here on the coast of Maine.
That's great. We've had a lot of ice this week, so I'm glad that it's been a little better today. So if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us a little bit about yourself as a child? Were you a bookish kid? Did you always want to be a writer? Things like that.
So I always say to my own students that my feeling about when people say, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? My feeling is, my response is, every child is born creative. Every child sings, dances, draws, writes, makes up stories, tells, stories that are often lies. There are all these ways that kids express their creativity. And over time, that diminishes. Children imagine that they're going to grow up to be a president or a fireman or there are all these wonderful, fanciful jobs that we imagine for ourselves as children. And also, we do all this creative stuff just as a part of being human. And then as time goes on, you sort of winnow it down and put that stuff aside. And I never put aside writing. And that is how I see it, that most people kind of move on to adult things. And I didn't ever quite do that. I did, in that I had to earn a living. So as I tell my own children who are now in their 20s, in their early 20s, follow your dreams, but also know that you probably need to have a vocation in addition to your avocation. So in my case, what that meant was getting qualified to teach at the college level, because I loved that age group. And working as an editor for many years. I edited manuscripts, I worked with publishers and agents, I worked with individual authors, and I had a business where I edited manuscripts, often many, many a year. And I ghost wrote books and I did all this stuff. So I just always crafted a life around writing. And I never knew if it would be a lucrative profession or not, but I knew that I wanted to do it.
That's fantastic. In all the research I did, I had not come across that you'd been an editor. So thank you. I've already learned something new about you.
Yeah, I did. When I was in graduate school, I started a company called Writing Works. And we edited, I was at the University of Virginia doing an MFA, and we edited professors' resignation letters. All kinds of crazy stuff, grant applications and PhD final theses and all this
Right.
stuff. It was a friend and I who were in the MFA program and did this together. And it was just such an eye opener. And then I moved to New York and continued to edit for a long time.
That's great. I'm an editor. I don't do manuscripts. I work with content marketing, but so I always love to meet fellow editors or people who have edited at times. How did that inform the process when you began writing yourself and for publishing and stuff and going through the editing process? How did that?
I do think that editing other people really helped me learn how to edit myself. And you get very ruthless and sort of figuring out exactly where the weak parts are and what you need to cut out and what you need to keep and what needs to be expanded upon. So I do think, even though sometimes I would feel like, oh my gosh, I'm spending my whole creative life editing, teaching, dealing with other people's stories. Eventually, in the end, I think it really helped my own writing to have that experience, both teaching and editing, where I was constantly working on other people's manuscripts.
And I would imagine it helped that you were familiar with the process to begin with, that you knew that editors had to help people through multiple revisions. And it wasn't just like, oh, you've written your one draft, you've revised it on your own, and then now you're ready to publish. So I think that's a learning curve that new authors may not necessarily always realize, just how many revisions you have to go through to get the gem that you end up with.
I'm reading the new George Saunders book, which is so fantastic. It's something a pond in the, I can't remember the title, but what he does, it's so great. He takes 7 stories by Russian masters and he analyzes them the way that he does with his own students. And he's looking at how and when and why revision happens, the decisions that were made along the way and all of that. And he talks quite freely about the fact that when he was a young writer, he did not feel that he needed to edit, and he didn't understand why he needed to edit his own work, which was, of course, pearls of wisdom. But he absolutely learned that he had to tear things up and put them back together. And he quotes Bill Buford, who actually I worked for as an assistant.
Okay.
Buford was the fiction editor of the New Yorker, but he sort of revived a magazine called Granta in Cambridge, England. And I worked for him there. And anyway, so this felt very recognizable to me. George Saunders said Bill Buford was the fiction editor, and George Saunders submitted a story. And Bill Buford, I can't remember if he accepted it. I think he might have, but George was sort of fishing for compliments. And he said, so, what is it that you like about the story? Because Bill Buford was editing it and had all these criticisms. And Bill Buford said, what I like is that I read one sentence and it made me want to read the next sentence. And George Saunders' point was, that's the secret of a good piece of writing, that you read one sentence and you want to read the next sentence. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. What pieces do you like to build on? Yes, it's one sentence at a time, but is there something that you kind of come back to each time you write that's your centering point?
Well, that's a really good question. I've actually never been asked that before, but it's such an interesting question about the creative process. I do think that writing fiction set in the past is a different undertaking than contemporary novels, where you're drawing on different kinds of inspiration, perhaps, in some ways. But for example, I'm working on a new book now, and today I was reading a text from the time period, which is the mid-19th century in Civil War era North Carolina, basically. And I have learned that there are these moments in the research when there's sort of this wow moment, and I learned something that I didn't know before that will inform some part of my story. So I'll give you an example. Today, there were a few of those today, but one of them was after the Civil War, Northerners were so intent on separating themselves from white Southerners. So white Northerners were so intent on separating themselves from white Southerners that there was a whole movement in Massachusetts and in the North to sort of classify them as a different species, that their brains and their physiognomy, the way they looked, and it's what people used to do about the Irish, actually, in long ago, which was there's a famous cartoon that appeared in England of the brain of a chimpanzee and the brain of an Irish person, and supposedly the chimpanzee was heavier. I mean, this anti-Irish sentiment, but because Northerners wanted to distance themselves so completely after the Civil War from Southerners, they essentially said they're a different species than we are, and we have nothing to do with that, even though, of course, white Northerners were complicit in all kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of moments are fascinating in the research, where you realize there's a whole world that you only know part of, and it's not until you really dig under the surface that you learn more about it.
That reminds me of something. We talked to Laurel Davis Huber, who wrote the book, The Velveteen Daughter.
Yes.
And she had been inspired because she had just one day was just bored when she was writing, and she was just looking at her bookshelf, and she came across a book that the author had written, or of course the author had written, that that was written by the artist, and I'm blanking on her name, but she is the daughter of the author of The Velveteen Rabbit. And so she was a child prodigy artist and everything. And then in her later years, she started to do some writing, but she'd written a children's book. And so she had that on her shelf, and she just was curious, who was this author? So she started looking into her, and it wasn't until 2 years into her research that she realized the connection between the author of The Velveteen Rabbit and the author she was researching for a book.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, there are all those sort of things that happen when you're working on a book. Yeah, for sure.
And that keeps it exciting, I'm sure.
Yeah, I love the research part of it. It's really fun. And, you're always making connections. You're always trying to figure out sort of where does this fit into the larger story. And to me, that's part of the joy of being able to jump into these other eras.
So it sounds like you're writing another historical novel.
I am. I mean, I didn't intend to, actually, but it's a family story involving my mother's great aunts, but just it's such a big, interesting story. I couldn't turn it down. So I am doing another novel set in the past. I keep thinking I'll go back to contemporary novels, but I haven't yet.
Well, you will when the story's right.
Right.
Right now, we're enjoying all the great historical fiction you're giving us, because you've given us so much in the last few years. I enjoyed your earlier work as well, but I came across you more recently. So the first book I read was Orphan Train. So to me, you excel at that, and I'm so thrilled that we're going to get more of that from you.
That's lovely. My father is a historian, and for many years I felt I had nothing in common with him. He's published a dozen books. He, most with university presses. He had a big book about Jesse Owens that became a miniseries and then a movie, and that was his one big, But other than that, he always wrote these very scholarly books, and I always thought, my novels have nothing to do with his work. But actually, as it turns out, the stuff I've been doing lately is so related to him, in that I have research methods that are really similar. We both write longhand. He's 83 and he's still going strong. So, it's fascinating to me that I've sort of evolved into someone who has taken his methodology and run with it. But yeah.
Was that something you think you evolved along the way, or did you just not realize early on in your career that you researched like he researched?
I didn't do that kind of research. I did research only for my contemporary novels, but there was this moment when I was at my father-in-law's, my husband's childhood home. So, my mother-in-law's house, her husband had died. My husband's father had died. But she opened a book in a blizzard. We were in a blizzard and my children were young and they needed to be entertained. And she opened this book that was a centennial celebration of her small town in North Dakota. And it was about the Orphan Train riders. There were newspaper articles, but one of them was about her father. And no one had known that he had ridden on an orphan train and had been part of this sort of historical moment. And that just, blew me away. I had no idea. And that was what set me off on the path of writing books set in the past.
I think you've probably been asked millions of times how you get your inspiration. And I think that is just indicative of how inspiration just happens in a moment. Something you read, something you might have thought of, written down, then found years later, something you heard someone say in a coffee shop. Those little moments
Exactly.
are what actually give you that inspiration.
But you know what the truth is, and I think this is a lesson for anyone who writes, those moments are there. And a lot of times we don't heed them or listen to them or understand them or pay attention. And part of it is because of our own fear. Like that's, we immediately turn them away. That's too big a story. That's too big an idea. That's too complicated. I could never do that. It has nothing to do with me. All these things. I mean, I felt all of that when I heard this Orphan Train story. I'm not Midwestern. It's not my story. I'm not a historian. I don't have a right to tell this story. There were a lot of reasons that I didn't feel I had any claim to this particular narrative. And it took me a while to do it. I wrote 2 other novels, I think, and a nonfiction book in between. And then I had been throwing things in a file. And I finally thought, you know what, if I don't do this, no one else has done exactly this yet. I should do this. I should do this because who else is doing it? But it is really hard to claim authority as a woman, as as someone who's not an expert in the field. And so it takes a lot of gumption to do it. And also it's so much work. It's a lot of work to do it. So you're taking on a lot. And are you worthy of it? Can you do it? I mean, and what I've come to love and discover and realize and understand about myself and maybe about writing in general is that if it's not scary, it's not worth doing. Like it has to be challenging. It has to be terrifying, or it's just not worth sticking with, because there are lots of stories to tell and people tell lots of stories, but the ones that really matter to me are the ones that are hardest to tell. Mm-hmm. And I felt I had no right to tell the Orphan Train story, no right to tell the story about Andrew Wyeth and the subject of his painting Christina's World, and then no right to tell the story that I've just told of the Exiles, which is the women who were exiled to Australia from England in the early to mid 19th century, and then the Aboriginal people who also lived there and were exiled from their own land. So that was a huge story, and I did not go into it easily. It was a hard, big story to tell.
Do you feel that with that hesitation, you said not worthy, or it's not your story to tell, do you feel that imposter syndrome in the fact that, yes, you're a writer, but you're this kind of writer, this kind of writing's different, I don't do this kind of writing, is that something that you think plays into it?
I think that was my lesson that I never got to in this whole conversation, which is I think you always feel like an imposter and you always have to embrace that. I mean, in a way, what is interesting about life, if you're not challenging yourself, if you're not pushing yourself, if you're not going for the thing that scares you and the thing that most perhaps interests you. Otherwise, life is, we're all stuck in our homes. We need things that interest us, right? And that challenge us. And hopefully this will all be ending soon. But I've discovered in this new year, especially, that having a big, scary project is actually one of the best things that could happen right now, because there's so much that feels out of my control and stay in this kind of stasis. Yeah. And I think it's really easy to get stuck in that. And How do you pull yourself out of it? Well, part of it is by challenging yourself. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do now.
I think that's great. It was a conference I went to 2 years ago, and it was an editing conference, and the whole thing was about being bold and just going for it, just doing it. And yes, if you want to work with publishers, go find publishers. If you want to work on academic papers, start talking to academic presses and students, and just do it.
I think part of it is people are so afraid of being rejected, which I completely understand.
You're a writer, of course you understand that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be in any creative profession, or honestly, any profession where you take a risk, people are not going to understand you or want to be, there's a lot of rejection to it, which I completely understand. And even if you get the brass ring, if you get the agent and the editor, then you get reviewed and someone might not like you. I mean, there are just a million ways that you can feel other people's judgment. But that's part of what you take on when you write, when you try to do anything that is, a creative project in any way, and or even just going out on a limb, honestly, in any way. So that's part of what I am trying to do, and to just embrace it and say, look, I don't like everything. I'm quite ornery in particular, and not everyone's going to like what I do. And that's part of the work. Mm-hmm. What's great is feeling that you reach a lot of people who really care about what you do. And I do get a ton of feedback about that. And so, part of this is when you're writing, when you're doing the work, you don't, you have to shut it all out and not care what anyone thinks. And afterwards, you have to say, there's going to be good and bad, and to any reception to anything. There was an article I just read today. There are many, like, don't we all read articles online all the time? And, half the people loved it and half the people were critical of it. Not my article, but someone else's. But I just thought, gosh, being a journalist means that you're up against this every single day when you write. Now, in the new world where we write and everything's online, you just get feedback immediately and you're always in the cross, hairs. So it's just part of life in the 21st century. And part of my job, I think, is separating my creative work from that. So when I'm working as I am now, I don't even think about that. It has nothing to do with it. Once it's published, you just have to learn to have equilibrium about it, because honestly, your book is done at that point. You've done however many revisions, like 10, 20 major revisions, and you've done everything you can do. And it's sort of out in the world and beyond your control.
One thing I like to tell clients of mine when they write a blog post or something is, because they'll get upset, like, well, this person didn't read the whole thing, because you can see how far people read down on websites. Yes. And they might be like, well, they didn't read, they're not reading it. And I'm like, but how many have you had that actually have read it? Those are the ones you're talking to. The ones that check it out and say it's not for them, that's fine. If someone buys your book and it's not for them, they can give it to a friend. It's just not for them. But you're going to have those people who that book that you wrote, that blog post that you wrote, is talking to. And there's the ones that you have to care about.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. For sure.
So your dad was a historian, and I believe that your mom was also a professor, correct?
She was. She actually got her PhD. I love this, at 46. When my younger sisters were in college, I guess. And she had been teaching at the college level forever in a community college. And she got her PhD, and then she went gangbusters. She was in the Maine state legislature, and she became a full professor. And, she died at 73, young, in my view, in our view, my sisters and I have 3 sisters. But she sort of lived life to the fullest. So she was a great example for us of someone who, who just was determined not to give up. She married in 1961, and supported her husband through grad school and had that very traditional sort of upbringing, and then moved on finally to sort of have her own career and life. And they stayed married and all that, but it was a complicated situation, and she persevered. And so she was sort of a role model, definitely, for me.
What was it like? For those of you who don't know, Christina wrote a book with her mother called The Conversation Begins. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience working with her?
Yeah. I mean, my mother and I didn't always have an easy relationship, so I wasn't sure that this would work out. But she was doing this incredible project at the University of Maine, where she was a professor. She was working on this oral history project of feminists, women from the second wave of the women's movement, like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, people like that, sort of doing a gathering their voices to talk about what they had been, what it was like in the time period. And meanwhile, I was living in New York City, and I was sort of in this world of people who were the daughters of those people in an interesting way. Gloria Steinem never had children, but many other women in the second wave did. And so we realized if we put our stories together, we could talk about what mothers and daughters of the women's movement felt about feminism and how and if it was passed from one generation to the next. So anyway, that was what we did. And we wrote this book called The Conversation Begins, and we interviewed 60 women. And I think it sort of led me to the Exiles, my new book, in a way, because it was really about the value of telling women's stories, and how, there's this great quote from Muriel Rukeyser. She said, if one woman were to tell the truth about her life, the world would split open. Split open, which I thought was so wonderful. And she basically, what she meant was, the history of our country and the history of the world is the history of men. It's a history of, presidents and generals and kings and treaties and wars, and women's stories have not been told so often. So I felt like doing that book with my mother, and then a few years later, teaching in an all-women's prison, where I became really interested in the criminal justice system, in why women end up in prison, in incarceration in general, and how and why people, what it accomplishes, what it leads to, was really interesting. And I think all of that led me to this book, The Exiles. So that was great. I mean, all of that experience. And I had gone to Australia as a Rotary Fellow in my mid-20s. And that was when I first formed all these questions that I wanted to ask about women and Aboriginal people in Australia.
In the course of your research with the Exiles, did you go back to Australia?
I went back twice. I had the most amazing experience there. I befriended, so in all of my recent books that have been set in the past, I befriended oddly, a woman in her 70s who's an expert in the field. So in Orphan Train, it was a woman named Renee Wendiger who runs the New York Train Riders Association. Her mother was an Orphan Train rider, and she's written multiple books about it. And with Piece of the World, my book about Andrew Wyeth, it was a tour guide at the Olsen House, which is where Andrew Wyeth painted Christina's World. And she's amazing, Rainey Davis. I'm still really close friends with her, and we hang out, and I adore her. And then for Exiles, it was this historian named Alison Alexander, who's written 35 books about the history of Australia, about the convict women, about Lady Jane Franklin and Sir John Franklin, who I read about in the book, and about Methina, who's a character in my novel. And I went to Australia, and we were able to hang out a lot and talk a lot. And I had dinner at her house almost every night. And it was just this very fertile conversation. And I felt very lucky to befriend her and be part of her world. So that was really helpful.
Do you think because you've had these personal connections that has helped the knowledge that they're imparting sink in versus
Oh, for sure.
dozens
For
of books
sure.
you read. I would think that you'd eventually, it just like at some point you're reading stuff, but you're not really completely taking everything in. But when you have that personal connection, that storytelling, that I find that kind of thing helps me remember things. I would imagine it might be the same for you.
Oh yeah. Well, so with Alice and Alexander, I stalked her online. I found her books, which were not available in America, a number of them. And I wrote to her on her website and I ordered them and we just became friends through email. And then when I got there, we were just immediately good friends. It made such a huge difference to be able to actually hang out with her and talk to her about her work, listen to this. It was a lifetime of study for her. She knew it inside out. And so it made a huge difference to be able to talk to her and see what it was really like. I mean, the problem with COVID is that I had actually booked a flight to go to North Carolina and to do and to meet with people who are very intimately involved in the stuff that I'm writing about at the moment. And I can't do it right now. So that's sort of interesting. Like, what do you do when you can't go and be part of the place? And not everybody who writes about the past does that, but I like to. I really feel that it helps. So I'm hoping that I can get there.
I hope so. I hope that this is over soon enough that you'll be able to not be too far along in your book. That it'll.
By the way, how are you guys with vaccines right now?
We're a mess, but
yeah.
Okay.
I know. I'm in Maine, and we have in my county, Hancock County, we have like virtually no cases, but there are also no vaccines. So it's like, yeah.
Yeah, I'm after Philadelphia County, I'm the largest county in the state. So we have a lot of people that need it. And I got in, my parents signed up through the county to get their shot. And it took a month for them to get a reply about when they could possibly even start to think. It wasn't yet to schedule. It was like, you can start to think that it'll be soon. There are over 300,000 people in the county in the first phase waiting. So yeah, it's going to take some time. But hopefully by the summer, you'll be able to have that flight down to Florida. North Carolina.
Yeah, to North Carolina. I hope so too.
And that could be a different challenge for you. If you've continued to write without that specific research that you get from that, then you'll be going back and adding more before maybe you would have had it to begin with. So that could be a new thing.
I think so. I mean, at some point I will get down there and it will be great. Yeah. By the way, anybody who's participating right now, I welcome your questions, and anything you want to ask would be great. And I'm sure Julie does too.
Of course, please. Just put it in the Q&A. So going back to Australia, race and class are universal topics. And like in the United States, especially right now, hopefully we're experiencing a turning point where we actually start to talk about the complicated issues that have spanned our country's history. Australia has a different history. They're a younger country, but they've still had a very complex history with colonization and classism, racism. In your acknowledgement, you mentioned that the first time you went to Australia, people didn't want to talk about anything about that. In your more recent visits, have you found that there's more of a conversation opening up there, like there's started to here?
Sure. So what happened when just starting from right now, when Black Lives Matter happened here, it reverberated across the globe, as you know, and there was all this incredible foment in Australia. So Aboriginal people, there were many marches and demonstrations, and there was a lot of sort of perhaps in some places for the first time conversations about all of this. Australia, like America, has had a tough time facing its past. When I went there for the first time after being there in the 90s, as a fellow, as I told you, 4 years ago, the prison that I write about in the novel, which is the Cascades Female Factory, had only opened 3 years earlier. So it as a museum and as a sort of UNESCO site. So it was they were giving tours and it was fantastic. There was all this stuff, but it was pretty new.
Mhm.
And the Tasmanian Museum of Aboriginal History that I went to had only been open for 4 months. So all of that was really new.
Mhm.
And in fact, since I've been, since between my visits 1 and 2, they created a sculpture to the convict experience on the waterfront. But so there was a lot of shame for people who were brought over from, I think I should step back and just say, what happened was, England was in the habit of sending their convicts to America, and they sent 50,000 people to America who were convicts before we declared independence and said, we're not putting up with that anymore. And then they started sending them to Australia. And so but Australia got founded as a penal colony, which is what makes it different from the United States. And today, 20% of Australians, about 5 million people, are descended from convicts, which is a pretty high number.
Yeah.
But it was until fairly recently, they called it the convict stain. People didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to, be affiliated with it. They felt like it was this real awful sort of burden that they bore. And now this generation, and then maybe perhaps the previous generation also, are willing to say or are happy to say, these are our people. I'm descended from convicts. They're scrappy, they're, they're innovative, they transform this country, et cetera. But for a lot of people, for a long time, it was very hard to admit that relationship. By the way, that's really similar to the Orphan Train riders, who many of whom went to their deaths without ever telling anyone that they had ridden on an orphan train, and even their children knew not to bring it up, or didn't know about it. So all of that has changed in the past 20 years. And now the descendants of Orphan Train riders are really proud of their ancestors. And same with, convicts. Like, these people came out of a very stratified society in England and Britain. And they got to a place where they could transform themselves, and many of them did. So it's actually a pretty amazing story. The story of the Aboriginal people is a little bit different, of course. Their land was taken over, and there's still a very complex relationship with the settlers who came in, the colonized, the British colonists in particular. But all of that is finally, it feels, being addressed. And so it's an interesting time in Australia right now.
That's great. I'm glad that, I feel like we've seen that on a broader context generationally, that there's more of a willingness to talk, but it's been very slow. Because we had the silent generation, right? by name. They didn't want to talk about the things they've been through. And I hope that, like you said, that these more recent generations will facilitate that conversation and crack it open even wider as the generations go forward.
Yeah, I hope so too. There's a lot to be discussed, and there's a lot going on in Australia right now politically. And I think that I've learned so much about it, and I'm in awe of the Australians who are really grappling with it. This novel, The Exiles, has been optioned by an Australian, a fabulous woman, Bruna Papandrea. The company's called Made Up Productions. They're based in Sydney, Australia, and in LA. And they did Big Little Lies, and they did Gone Girl, and they just did The Undoing and Wild. They've done all these great shows. But they've also done a ton of Australian shows. And they really seem to understand what this series, it will be a series, will be, and how it should function. And I'm very excited about that. And also because it feels like, I'm an American, born in England, dual citizenship, but I'm an American. And to have that sort of stamp of approval from Australia is really nice. But also I think they understand that there's a lot to address in this question of their very complicated past, as we can see in our own.
Well, I'm sure that must be a comfort to know that this company that's going to be producing your work actually gets your work.
Yeah, and also that they're there, and so it will be filmed in Australia, and it's very much a part of that, the warp and woof of their lives, and they understand all the political points and all of the sensitivities, and how the story should function.
When I read your books, you just create a movie. I naturally see books as movies when I read, but yours just lend itself so beautifully to that movie in my mind. Your details, like I can smell things. I can hear the sounds of the water in the boat, and and I can't wait to see how this translates onto the screen, because you've set it up beautifully to be deconstructed that way.
Well, one interesting thing is that I had so many things the book is not that short. It's 300 and whatever, 60 or 70 pages, but it's big. But, yeah, there's so much that I cut. And when I was talking with the production team about doing this miniseries, I sent them all the stuff that I had cut, all these storylines that I didn't follow through. And so I think we'll be able to do some of that in the production, which is fun.
That's fun, yeah.
But we have to get through COVID and get through this period, and be able to do it. Yeah.
You're going to be an executive producer on it, correct?
Yeah, which I'm really excited about, because I'm kind of bossy and I like to be bossy. But I'm involved. My other two recent novels are both also, in the COVID world of being, all this stuff is happening, but we're not sure what will happen with them. Right. But I'm not an executive producer, so I can't be quite as involved. But I'm glad to be doing this. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of faith that you put in blindly when your work is optioned. Because most of the time people don't have that control. They don't have the say in the script. They don't have the say in any kind of details like sets and locations and even costumes they might choose to completely take it out of a different time zone and change things. And you don't have that control, but in this position, you'll be able to say, no, there was a reason I wrote it this way.
That's right. And I will say that's one of the things about old age that's lovely, is that you get to you've been around for a while and you're like, okay, I'm not going to accept this time. Now I'm going to demand that I can do this. So yeah.
Well, I'm excited for it. I hope the experience is a good one for you.
Thanks. I hope so too. I'll report back in a few years.
Yes. Right? Yes.
We have some questions.
We do, and I would love to get to them. Let's see. Talia asks, having been an editor, how do you work with your editor? Oh, and it happens to be one we share, Kate.
Exactly. So Talia Carner is an amazing writer. Hi, Talia. Thank you for being here so much. My editor, Kate Ninzel, so our editor, I should say, because Talia is with her also. I don't know, we should have our own private conversation, because I just think that she's amazing. So we happen to have lucked into, you hear a lot of horror stories about New York City editors, but Kate is a real editor. She has kind of a heavy hand in a good way. Mm-hmm. She really cares, and she will say, I think we need to change this structure. And one of the things she always just says is that my stories, she always wants to sort of trim the beginning and add it in later or cut it. And I think she's often right about that. She is right about that. I feel very lucky to have an editor that I'm so sort of simpatico with. And Talia, I'm not sure how you feel about this, but like today, for example, we were editing copy for something for the paperback. And she said, I'm going to take a stab at this last paragraph. I mean, this wasn't my fiction, but it was a nonfiction thing I was writing. And she was just like, it was perfect. So I said, this is great. Thank you so much for doing exactly what I wanted to write, but wasn't able to get to.
Mhm.
So I will say for people who are doubting the New York City publishing world that there are editors still who do serious editing, and she is definitely one of them. I do sometimes, I wouldn't say reject her suggestion, but I'll question it. But she's so good that I have to think about it a lot before I do that. And that's sort of what you want, is someone who's so smart and so talented that even if your first impression is, I don't agree with you, you have to take it seriously because you know they're really smart and really thinking about it in the way that you are. And there is we were laughing actually this time that we both had such engagement in the manuscript that there were little words that we were questioning together. And she and I were the only people in the whole universe who would really care about these small words. But you want someone like that. You want someone who's going to engage you about, like, should it be prescient here or noticing? I mean, whatever it is, and she'll be like, let me think about that.
That's great. You've worked with her for multiple books, haven't you?
Yeah, I've worked with her ever since my novel, The Way Life Should Be, which was sort of a romantic comedy set on the coast of Maine, quite different from these novels that I've written. But she just sort of, I just feel like I can be myself with her. And that's
what you
the best
want.
thing ever. Yeah.
Yeah. Someone who gets you and what you're trying to do.
Someone who gets you. Exactly. Yeah. I know.
Sandy asks, who do you pick as beta readers for your manuscripts?
That's a really good question. First of all, I don't show my work to anyone until it's pretty far along. I don't want to say done because I obviously have, not obviously, but I do know that I always have many drafts to go. But it depends on the novel. At first, my husband used to do it a lot. He's got such a busy job that I don't burden him as much anymore. But this last novel, I had a really close friend who's a brilliant writer named Bonnie Friedman, who just was there for me with the whole book all the way through. And there were other readers that I had at different points, but she was just sort of my in there with me, doing it with me writer friend. And I just felt so lucky to have her engaged in the book. And I think that it's really it's about finding someone you trust who's going to be kind to you, but also clear about what isn't working, but also whom you trust intellectually and sort of narratively to stick with it and to be with you in your process. It's hard. That's a hard thing. And Bonnie, again, like Kate, my editor and Talia's editor, would care about like where a comma went and where, what word was perfect where. And that, when you come down to it in the end, that sort of matters. Mm-hmm. And there aren't a lot of people who care at that level. So it was great.
In addition to beta readers, did you have any sensitivity readers for the Exiles?
Oh my gosh, I did. I had three really. First of all, I worked with Allison Alexander, who's a world expert in convict history. And then I also worked with this incredible guy, Greg Lehman, who is actually a world-renowned expert in Aboriginal history, politics, literature. He consults with museums, with writers, with universities. He's been on many faculties, but he's now at the University of Tasmania running their Tasmanian history wing. And he himself is descended from a Tasmanian tribe of Aboriginal people. And he was super helpful. He's consulted with a bunch of other novelists like Richard Flanagan as well. But in addition to him, because of the moment we're in, which is completely valid and important and necessary, and also the way it should be, I wrote this novel about convict women. I intended to write about convict women, But I realized that the stuff that was happening to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people was at exactly the same time period. And it would be irresponsible for me not to address it. So I had to. And I wrote about Methina, who's a person who really lived. And her life story was short and tragic. But I couldn't not tell that story. And so, as I said, I consulted with Professor Lehman, who was fantastic and has written about Methina quite a bit and consulted on other projects about her. And then my publisher hired 2 different sensitivity readers and a media trainer because they were worried about, about the valid and real and true and important and also completely understandable concern about appropriation. And I didn't write the book in the first person. I wrote it in the third person, in part to have a little distance and not to be writing in the voice of an Aboriginal person, but I wanted to show the story and what happened to Methina. And so that required jumping through a lot of hoops. And I also think the book wouldn't be as rich without that story. So I'm really glad I told it, but it was, it's a complicated question. And the related question about there's the question of whether I have the right to tell the story. And then there's the question of whether I'm taking that story away from anyone. Methina is well known in Australia, and there are several novels about her. There's a ballet in the Bangarra Dance Company in Sydney did this beautiful ballet about her. There are nonfiction accounts. So she's been written about quite widely in Australia. I didn't feel that I was taking that story from anyone, but it's a complicated question. And this is one of the issues of writing about the past is like, what are the parameters? What are you allowed to write about? So that was part of the question.
And I think going with that is when you write about people from the past, yes, there are guidelines that you have to adhere to. When you write about someone that you create on your own, there's so much freedom, but you don't have the framework. So finding that balance with this novel, because you did both, must have been a brain exercise at times, trying to create a fully developed character that you'd never met, but who was a real person. And then these multiple other characters that were completely your own. And
yeah, definitely. I mean, always melding fact and fiction is really complicated. And how do you make that realistic and believable? And it's just something you often encounter if you write about the past, especially about something that really happened, a time period, something in the past that, with real historical figures.
Let's see. Sheila says, love this conversation. How much research did you have to do for the Exiles? Given that their history is specific and so different, as Julie said, can you tell us anything more about the ways you have stretched creatively in your research and writing from home, not being able to travel?
I'm just starting to really write this new book. And right now my process is very similar because to the process for the other books, except that I can't travel, as I've said. But I will say one interesting thing is that I didn't even like to Skype before COVID, and now I Zoom kind of all the time. So in a funny way, I actually think what was it? Who was it who asked that question? Julie? No.
It was Sheila.
Sheila. Hi, Sheila. I actually was thinking about this today, that I had to cancel my flight, my hotels, everything to go to North Carolina. I had set up meetings with all these people, but I think I should probably start thinking about pursuing it over Zoom. I mean, here I am, and here we are doing this. It's not the same. And I do want to go down and see and feel the place itself, but I can initiate some conversations on Zoom, and I need to do that. And that will be the next step. Right now, I'm kind of really deeply immersing myself in the literature that I can find, and it's fascinating.
That's great. I think that when you go to travel places and you have specific people you want to talk to, you may only have limited amount of time when you're actually with them in person.
Right.
So you might be able to make multiple visits with them because you're doing it virtually, and then eventually in the person, you might be able to get more out of it that way.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's really true. So, and you can do multiple visits, as you've said. So that is a great thing about Zoom for sure.
Janice asks, how do you decide on point of view when you write your historical novels?
That is always a hard conversation. How do you decide on point of view when you write your novels? I mean, it's sometimes trial and error, but mostly it is kind of I suppose this is the same thing, feeling my way along. In the case of the Exiles, I felt like a third person limited point of view is the way to go for sure. It just felt like such a big story, and that I could sort of have this slight level of consciousness above the consciousness of the characters, so that you're looking down on them from above in a minor way, not like an omniscient narrator, but I'm sort of tempted to do an omniscient narrator because I've been reading so much Edith Wharton and 19th century, early 20th century, late 19th century novelists recently. And I wonder if I need to try an omniscient narrator, which I've actually never done, which is a narrator who can see into everyone's heads. But my next novel at the moment is set in the heads of two women who are central to this story, and we'll see how that goes. It's a very hard question, and I will say that sometimes you switch. I have had instances where I've been writing in one third person and I switch to first, and it's sort of about feeling out what feels more natural,
and what voice you're actually getting right.
Yeah. And I think there's a way that first person, I always feel guilty when I do first person, even though in some ways it's more immediate because it feels a little easier. Third person requires more cerebral connections in a way. First person, you're sort of in that character's story, but you also limit yourself in all these ways. And then there's another whole question of whether you write in the past or the present tense. Like in Orphan Train, I wrote first person present tense for the story that was woven through, and third person present tense for the present day story. And what that means is that you can't ever talk about what's happening with any perspective. Right. So you deny yourself that opportunity. Anyway, whatever, this is very technical, but that's part of the algorithm, I think, that you think about when you're working on it.
Talia says, I love Kate. Sandy asks, what book would you recommend someone read if they want to learn more about Methina?
There are a bunch. So, there's a novel by Richard Flanagan, which I mentioned, called Wanting. I'm not sure how much more you'll learn about her, but it is about, so Charles Dickens, his life sort of intersected in a funny way with Methina's. And that's what this novel by Richard Flanagan is about, called Wanting. But one thing I would say is look, and this is on my website, the Bangara Dance Company's ballet about Methina is really spectacular, and I love it. And I would recommend that you look at that. And if you Google her, you'll find all this stuff online, and it sort of will take you down different rabbit holes about her. Alison Alexander's biography of Jane Franklin, called Lady Jane, I believe, has a bunch also about Methina, but I'm not sure it's available in the United States. I had to special order it from Australia. Methina is in Wikipedia. You can actually find links to lots of stuff about her if you go there. So
I know
we're at the end here.
Yes, I have two more if you're okay with sticking around for them.
Sure.
Okay. In a minute, when we're ending, I will show a quick slide that has Christina's contact information. So it has her website and her different social media channels. There's amazing resources on her website that I recommend everyone check out. She has a lot of different sources of what she read for various things, not just about Methina, for not just the Exiles too, but for her other works too. So check out all of that amazing content that she has on her website. So then Carol asks, I came in late and may have missed this. What is your new book about? The one you're working on now. Now you told us that it was about a family thing in the South during the Civil War, and it has 2 women, but we don't know anything else. Are you allowed to tell us anything more?
Well, I stopped telling people what it was about, but because this is a special group, I will add, is this our last question?
We had 2 more. I mean, sorry, one more.
Okay.
You want to hold that one? We can hold
this one for the end.
Okay, I'll pop it up and just let me cut up. The one was, what do you read for fun?
I read all the time. I am having, so I don't know what you guys felt, but during COVID, for the first few months, I felt like I was in a fog. First of all, this book was coming out and I was dealing with all of that in hardcover at the end of August. So I had to do a ton of stuff for that, but I could not concentrate. I just had the worst time. And somehow, starting in January, I've been able to concentrate and I'm reading so much. So right now, do I have it here? No, it's downstairs. I am reading The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. I'm reading, as I told you, I'm reading all the Edith Wharton right now, which is super fun. I'm reading George Saunders' new book, which is amazing. I'm reading books to blurb that are coming out in late spring and summer, which are going to be so great. Let's see if I have one here. Here's one, The Ride of Her Life. Elizabeth Letts is coming out in June, and it's really interesting and fun. So there are a lot, and I do a lot of events with other writers, so I'm always reading their books in advance of those, which is kind of the fun thing about being a writer, is that you get like every day I get a couple of books in the mail, and it's always kind of interesting to see what people are doing in the world. But more than anything, I think I'm just finally back in reading and thinking about reading and in the world of ideas in that way. And that's super exciting. I'm also doing a bunch of research, as I told you, for my book right now. So it's just a whole world of reading at the moment, taking notes.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you love it. That a little bit, Julie.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah. I mean, part of when back to our original, I mean, look, we're leaving, we're done. But part of my original, the thing that I said at the very beginning, which was I just wanted to craft a world around words, basically around, I have a life that is about reading and writing. And that's, I'm teaching in 2 different programs, and I'm not editing that much anymore, except for friends and children applying to college. I read their college essays, and I'm, and just writing. And that's sort of that's what I'm good at. That's what I care about, I guess.
I'm going to ask one more question before you tell us about your new book. I like to give authors a chance to talk about any of the literary organizations or nonprofits that they're passionate about. So if you have any that you'd like to share, I know you're on a board with boards of a bunch of different programs. So is there anything that you'd like us to check out?
Sure. I mean, the Authors Guild, for anybody who's an aspiring writer, a new writer, the Authors Guild provides opportunities for legal representation. Like if you're working on a contract or someone wants you to do something and you're not sure whether you're protected, they're really helpful with that. So I'm quite a bit involved in that organization at the moment. The Center for Fiction in New York City, which is also national and have programs all over the place. I'm on the advisory board there, and they're fantastic. I'm very involved in an organization called Roots and Wings, New Jersey, which is a foster care organization. And I'm on the advisory board there as well. They're great. And there are a bunch more, but those are some that are really important and useful for 2 for writers, and 1 just for helping kids in need that is doing a fantastic job. So I always love to talk about them.
And we're happy to share that information and have everyone go check out those sites.
That's great.
So thank you. And now tell us
okay, so very quickly, I think I can say this maybe in 1 sentence. Okay, so my mother's, I always say great aunts, but it's not quite that. My mother's first cousins, several times removed, were 2 sisters, Sarah and Adelaide Yates, who lived in Civil War era North Carolina, and they married 2 brothers who happened to be sideshow freaks in a traveling circus. Okay. And their names were Chang and Ang Bunker. They were the original Siamese twins.
Wow.
And they had 21 children.
Wow.
1 couple had 10 and 1 had 11. And they lived in North Carolina, and they had really interesting lives. And when I always knew my whole life that I was related to them. Mm-hmm. But when my cousin, who's very involved in genealogical research, about a year ago, a year and a half ago maybe, sent me a notice about the reunions of the families, I realized this is a story that I should tell from the perspective of the 2 wives, Sarah and Adelaide, my mother's relatives. And so the novel's called The Foursome, and it's the story of the marriages of these 2 couples.
That sounds fascinating.
I know. Isn't that crazy?
Well, so thanks for sharing that.
It's really fascinating. And if anyone out there has information, let me know. Yeah.
We have a North Carolina chapter. Should we put them on it?
Yeah, definitely put them on it. Definitely put them on it. Mo Rocca, there's a comedian named Mo Rocca, and he has a show called Mobituaries where he talks about like crazy things in the past. He did an episode on Orphan Train, so I got to know him through that. And then he was doing an episode on Chang and Ang, and he connected me with all these people. And I'm part of the Bunker family, Chang and Ang Bunker is their last name, private Facebook, secret Facebook group. So, so it's just fascinating, and it's very rich material.
Well, I hope you have fun with it.
Thank you.
I know that we've had fun talking to you, so thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It's great to be here. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around.
Yes, I'm going to quickly, if you'd like to leave, you may. Thank you. I'm just going to pop up your information so that everyone can have it. Let me.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So here is the book we were talking about most of the time was the Exiles. So you can get that now. And then here is Christina's information. You can check out her website, her Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and follow her on there. And like I said, I definitely suggest that you all check out her website. So much good information. And the videos she was talking about, the dance videos are on there too, so you can see some clips. So thank you so much for attending tonight. You can visit our website and check out what upcoming events we have. At the end of the month, we will be having a Bookwoman Book Club discussion about Tea by the Sea. And then we will be talking to the author, Donoghue, on, I believe it's the 25th. So if you can join us then, we'd love to have you. So thank you so much and have a good night.